The high desert wind was a constant thief, stealing the moisture from your skin and the hope from your heart. It swept down from the red mesas of the New Mexico territory, tasting of alkali and millennia of sun-baked stone. This was the late 1870s, and the land was a harsh creditor, demanding everything and giving back only what it pleased. The Hart Ranch was braced against this land, not built upon it. It was a modest collection of sod and timber tucked into a shallow canyon, just 2 miles north of the main stagecoach road. That road, and the miner's trace that split from it, brought a steady stream of dust but very little comfort. Elena Hart understood the dust. She lived by it. At 24, she was the spine of the place, and she felt the weight of it every morning when the sun first struck the canyon wall. She was practical, which was the only way to survive. Hope was a luxury. Like lace, she preferred good leather and a solid well pump. She was working on the pump now, reseating a leather washer, her hands deft and sure. They were not soft hands. Her mother, Martha, watched from the shade of the porch, her hands twisting in her apron. "Elena, you should not ride to town alone," Martha said, her voice thin against the groan of the windmill. "Not with these stories." Elena finished her work, testing the heavy handle. It drew smoothly. She wiped the grease from her fingers onto a piece of burlap. "The stories are just stories. Ma, we need flour." She wore a man's canvas trousers and a faded blue shirt, practicality winning out over propriety. At her hip, in a worn holster, rested the Colt Peacemaker. It was a heavy, comforting weight, a tool like any other. She was a fine shot, better than most, but she took no pleasure in it. It was just another chore, like darning socks or splitting kindling. Martha's lips thinned. "That gun is not company. It is a tragedy waiting to happen." Elena sighed and managed a small, tight smile as she moved to the stable. She was stubborn, and her mother knew it, but she would offer the comfort, "Oh, Ma, I only shoot when they complain my cooking's bland." Martha did not return the smile. Her grief for her husband, 2 years gone, had settled into a permanent winter. An hour later, Elena was riding her bay mare toward the cluster of buildings that called itself a town. It was little more than a single dusty street, a raw scar in the landscape. At one end sat the imposing false front of Prescott's Bank. At the other, the double doors of the dusty Lily Saloon seemed to inhale and exhale the town's rougher elements. And in the middle, a squat building with barred windows declared itself the office of Sheriff Mace. Mace was on the boardwalk, tilted back in a chair, boots crossed on the rail. He was a large man, notorious for a peculiar kind of quiet. He kept the peace, but it was his peace, a brittle arrangement that benefited those who, like Mr. Prescott, signed his checks. He watched Elena ride in, his eyes missing nothing. He did not nod. Elena did not look at him. It was the way of things. Order was a negotiation, and she had nothing to bargain with. Inside the general store, the air was thick with the smells of cured tobacco, pickle brine, and new denim. She gathered her flour, coffee, and a small bag of salt, aware of the men talking by the stove. Even in the heat, "It was Apaches," one said, "a prospector with a sun-scorched neck. Saw it myself. They was painted, hit the stage near Cottonwood Creek." The storekeeper, a nervous man named Fields, polished a glass jar. "That's the 3rd time this month. They're getting bold." "Bold," the prospector spat. "They're devils. That's what they are. Sheriff ought to round 'em all up. Put 'em where they can't hurt decent folk." Elena paid for her goods, her face a careful, neutral mask. She knew the stories. Everyone knew the stories. Fear was as common as the dust, a constant grit in the mouth. There was talk of a band of robbers who struck fast and vanished, leaving behind signs that pointed to the Chiricahua. It fed the hatred that already simmered in the territory, the deep-seated resentment of settlers who saw the land as empty, ignoring the people who had been there for centuries. Elena cinched the flour sack to her saddle. She hated the simple, easy blame. It was too neat. Her father had died in a fire that swept the south pasture and took the old barn with it. The whispers had blamed the Apache, but there had been no proof, just whispers. She had learned then that justice was often just the loudest voice in the room. She rode out, pushing the mare into a steady trot, eager to leave the town's suffocating certainty behind. The sun was beginning its long, fiery descent, painting the western mesas in shades of blood and orange. That was when she felt it. A prickle on the back of her neck, the feeling of being watched. She reined in the mare, her hand falling naturally to the walnut grip of the peacemaker. The canyon was silent, save for the wind and the jingle of the bridle. She scanned the high ridge to her left. Nothing, just jagged rock and the skeletal remains of a lightning-struck pine. She waited, her eyes tracing the shadows. A flicker of movement, impossibly high up. It was not a deer, it was not a coyote. It was as if a piece of the shadow itself had detached, observed, and then melted back into the stone. Her heart kicked once, hard. The rumors took on a new, sharp focus. They spoke of a particular man, an Apache scout who had once worked for the army. Breaking a treaty, they said, a man named Koyani. They said he was a phantom, that he could read a man's passage over bare rock, that he could tell from a single broken twig how many riders had passed and what they carried. They said he read tracts like a white man reads the Holy Bible. He was a ghost story made real, and the settlers feared him as much as they feared the drought. Elena urged her horse forward, dismissing it. A trick of the light, the heat playing with her eyes. But the feeling remained, a cold spot between her shoulder blades, all the way back to the ranch. She unsaddled the mare in the cooling twilight, the smell of pine smoke from her chimney a welcome, ordinary thing. She gave the horse a measure of oats, her movements economical, her mind already on mending the harness that had frayed. She was turning to leave the corral when she saw it. On the top rail of the fence post nearest the gate, a carving. It was new. It had not been there this morning. She stepped closer, her hand again on her revolver. The carving was small, no bigger than her thumb, but cut with a deep, unnerving precision. It was a bird, its wings spread wide, and from those wings rose shapes that looked unmistakably like flames. A bird in fire. Her blood went cold. This was no prospector's mark, no idle whittling. It was a sign. Her first thought was of the men in the store, the raiders, the painted Apaches. A threat, a marker. They were telling her she was next. They had been here, at her home, while she was gone. She stood frozen for a long moment, the heavy sack of flour suddenly forgotten in her other hand. The vast, silent territory seemed to crowd in, pushing against the small, fragile fence line of the ranch. Sheriff Mace's false order was a joke. Prescott's bank was an abstraction. Out here, there was only the land, the sky, and the things that moved in the shadows. Elena looked back at the high ridge, now a black silhouette against a bruised purple sky. The shadow, she knew, had been real, and it had been watching. 2 days later, the carving on the fence post had not changed. Elena had touched it once, tracing the deep grooves of the bird and the flames. It felt like a burn on her own property, a violation that hummed with a quiet, waiting energy. She had told her mother it was just a traveler's mark, a lie that tasted like ash in her mouth. She was resetting a loose stone in the well wall when the sound reached her, thin and sharp on the wind. Gunshots. They came from the southeast, from the direction of Cottonwood Creek. It was not the single, deliberate crack of a hunter's rifle. It was a volley, ragged and desperate, followed by 3 more precise shots. Then, silence. Martha came to the doorway of the ranch house, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face was pale. That was trouble. Elena? Elena was already moving. She ran to the small shed by the stable, grabbing the heavy leather satchel. It was stitched with waxed thread, her father's old tool bag. But now it held bandages, a bottle of carbolic, sutures, and a small flask of whiskey. "You are not going," Martha said. It was not a question. It was a command born of old fear. "That is Sheriff Mace's business." Elena slung the bag over her shoulder and moved to her mare, her movements quick and certain. "If someone is bleeding, it is my business, Ma." She checked the peacemaker at her hip, ensuring it was loose in the holster, and swung into the saddle. "Elena, do not, I forbid it. Remember your father. Remember the fire." The words struck her, as they always did. "I remember," Elena said, her voice tight. "That is why I'm going." She nudged the mare into a hard gallop, leaving her mother standing like a small, lonely statue in the dust. The ride to Cottonwood Creek took less than 20 minutes. The air grew thick with the metallic smell of spent powder and something else, something coppery and sweet that turned her stomach. She slowed the mare as she entered the grove of trees. It was a trap. The clearing was a place of terrible stillness. The stagecoach was gone. The team of 4 horses was dead in their harnesses. The driver, a man named Silas she had shared coffee with last month, was slumped over a large rock, his rifle still in his grip. Near him lay a man in a city suit, a passenger. Both were still. Elena dismounted, her rifle in her hand, her medical bag bumping against her hip. She scanned the trees, the rocks. Nothing moved. The attackers were long gone. She checked Silas first. There was nothing she could do. She moved to the passenger, her stomach tightening. She forced herself to look, to be certain. He was also gone. She found the 3rd man by the creek bed. He was not with the others. A trail of disturbed gravel and dark spatters led from the road into the deep shade of the largest cottonwood. He was sitting up, his back against the trunk, and he was Apache. Elena froze. Her hand tightened on her rifle stock. He was young, perhaps a few years older than her. His body lean and powerful, even in collapse. His black hair was matted with sweat and dirt. He was wearing canvas trousers, not buckskin, and a torn cotton shirt that was soaked dark red from his left shoulder down to his waist. His eyes were open. They were not the wild, hate-filled eyes the stories described. They were dark, intelligent, and blazing with a pain so deep it looked like anger. He watched her every move. Pinned to the center of his chest, driven through the fabric and into the skin beneath, was a square of rough paper. On it, in crude black letters, she could read the words, "Apache murderer, $200. Her gaze swept the ground around him. The dust was littered with brass. She bent and picked one up. A .44 Henry. She picked up another. The same. She looked back at Silas's rifle. It was a larger caliber. A Sharps. These casings were not his. They were not Army issue. They were the favored ammunition of bounty hunters, men who liked repeating rifles and fast, dirty work. The man against the tree had not moved, but his breathing was shallow. A sharp hiss between his teeth. Elena looked at the sign pinned to his chest, then at the .44 shells, then at the ambush. The story did not fit. This was not a raid. It was an execution, a sloppy one. She slung her rifle back onto her shoulder and walked toward him. He tensed, his right hand moving weakly toward a knife at his belt. "I am not here to finish the job," Elena said, her voice low and steady. He did not relax. She knelt a few feet away, out of his reach, and opened her medical bag. She pulled out her shears and a roll of clean bandage. "I am going to help you, if you let me." He watched her, his eyes narrowed. "This will hurt," she said, moving closer. She reached for the paper on his chest. It was held by a small, sharp tack. She worked it free gently. He flinched but made no sound as it pulled from his skin. She tossed the sign away. Then, with the shears, she began to cut the blood-soaked shirt away from the wound. It was ugly. The bullet had entered from the back, high on the shoulder, and torn its way through. It was bleeding badly, rhythmically, soaking the ground beneath him. She pressed a thick pad of cotton against the wound. Hard. A choked sound, half a breath, half a groan, escaped him. His whole body went rigid. She held the pressure, her face inches from his. Hold still. You move. You bleed faster. She worked quickly, her hands sure. She packed the wound, her mind focused only on the tearing, the muscle, the flow of blood. She was aware of the heat radiating from his skin, the smell of his sweat. He was bleeding onto her trousers, onto the toe of her worn leather boot. You are bleeding on my boot, she said. The words were flat, practical, an anchor in the middle of the madness. His eyes focused on her, a flicker of something, maybe surprise, breaking through the pain. He tried to shift. I will pay, he whispered. His voice was a dry rasp. He swallowed. I will pay. With a horse, one no one has ridden. A grim smile touched Elena's lips, gone as quickly as it came. First, you have to live. She began to wrap the bandage, tight, pulling it around his chest and over the shoulder. Can you ride? He nodded. A short, sharp movement. It took all her strength and most of his to get him to his feet. He was heavier than he looked, and his left side was useless. He leaned on her, and she felt the tremor of his muscles. They half walked, half fell toward her mare. Getting him into the saddle was a desperate, clumsy struggle. He nearly fainted twice, but at last he was seated, slumped forward. His good hand tangled in the mare's mane. Elena mounted behind him, pulling his weight back against her. She held him with one arm, the reins in the other, and urged the mare into a walk, heading not for the ranch house, but for the canyon wall, toward the ruins of the old stable. It was the place where her father had been trapped, a skeleton of charred beams and tumbled stones, but one section, the part built against the rock, had survived. It was hidden. It was safe. She got him inside, onto a pile of old straw, just as the last of his strength gave out. He collapsed onto his side, unconscious. She ran to the house. Martha met her at the door, her face a question Elena did not want to answer. I need water, Elena said, brushing past her, and more bandages, and the laudanum. Martha grabbed her arm. Who is in that stable? A man. He is wounded. Martha's eyes went wide. She followed Elena back out, across the yard, her steps hurrying to keep up. Who? Elena. Elena did not answer until they were at the stable door. Martha pushed past her and stopped. The light from the setting sun cut through the broken roof, illuminating the man on the straw. Martha's hand flew to her mouth. An Apache. He is a man, Elena said, her voice sharp with exhaustion. And he was shot. Have you lost your mind? Martha whispered, her voice shaking. Have you forgotten? An Apache. They burned. They killed your father. Elena dipped a rag in the water she had carried and knelt by the man. We do not know that. We only know what people said. Martha was backing away, her hands twisting. They will find him here. They will know we helped him. Elena, they will burn us out. They will finish what they started. Elena looked up from the man's pale, sweat-streaked face. She thought of the .44 casings. She thought of the crude, lying poster. This man was not a raider. He was the prey. I am saving a man, not his color. Martha stared at her, her grief and fear warring with the stubborn set of her daughter's jaw. She said nothing. She just turned and fled back to the house. Elena let out a long breath and turned back to her patient. The laudanum would help with the pain, but he had lost too much blood. She needed to keep him warm. She gently moved his arm to clean the wound again, and her hand brushed the knife at his belt. She paused. She had seen it at the creek, but her mind had been on the wound. Now, she looked. It was a simple knife, the blade sharp and clean, the handle made of antler, worn smooth with use. Carved deep into the bone was a small, precise image, It was a bird. Its wings spread wide, and from those wings rose shapes that looked exactly like flames. Elena's heart stopped. She looked from the knife to the man's unconscious face. She thought of the identical mark on her fence post. It had not been a threat. It had been a warning. He was awake. His eyes were open when she returned with a lantern, and they were fixed on the empty sheath at his belt. Elena held up the knife. "I did not take it," she said. "I was looking at the carving." He did not try to sit up. He knew he could not. His gaze was sharp, a weapon in itself, assessing her, the broken stable, the shadows. "Why?" he rasped, his voice rough. "Why?" she repeated, confused. "Why did you bring me here?" "Because they were bounty hunters," Elena said, setting the lantern on a rock. "And that sign they pinned to you was a lie." His eyes closed for a second. He had not expected that answer. She spent the next 3 days in the ruined stable. Her mother, Martha, left a bucket of broth and clean rags at the stable door every morning. A silent, unwilling compromise. She would not step inside. She would not look at him. Koyani, as she learned his name was, had a fever that burned hot and fast. Elena forced water and thin broth past his cracked lips. She cleaned the wound. She sat and watched him breathe in the dusty half-light, the peacemaker resting on her lap. On the 4th day, the fever broke. He woke clear-headed, and the pain returned. A clean, sharp agony that replaced the haze. He sat up, his back against the stone wall, and surveyed his prison. She brought him a plate of beans and cornbread. He ate, his movements economical, his good hands steady. "You should not stay," he said. "They will look for me." "Let them look," Elena said. "This is the last place they will search. This place is full of ghosts." His eyes met hers. He understood. A strange partnership began, born of necessity and silence. Elena would tend the wound, and Koyani, trapped in the stable, would watch. He saw things she had never noticed. "The windmill," he said one afternoon, his voice stronger. "The fan is broken." Elena sighed, rubbing her neck. "I know. The gear is stripped. I cannot fix it." He asked her to bring him the mechanism. She did, dumping the heavy, greasy gears onto a piece of burlap. He studied them for an hour, turning them with his one good hand. Then he asked for a file and a piece of tin. He worked all day, his movements precise. He was not just fixing the gear. He was reshaping it, filing a new tooth from the tin, seating it with a patience that was almost frightening. He was trading work. She mended his body. He mended her water supply. While he worked, she watched the ridges. "You are watching the wrong way," he said, not looking up from the gear. "What?" "You look at the rock. You should look at the air above it." Elena frowned. "The air?" "The wind," Koyani said. "It is a voice. It tells you where the dust moves. It tells you what is coming. When the riders come, they will bring a scent of iron and panicked sweat. The wind will tell me an hour before you see them." She sat with him, and he taught her to read the subtle shifts of the dust devils, to smell the difference between dry heat and the distant promise of moisture. He was not just a warrior. He was a man who listened to the world. He trusted her enough to speak. He told her about the knife. "It is a warning," he said, "for those who are not blind. I left it on your fence. I saw you in town. I saw you had no part in the hate." "And the ambush?" He shook his head. "They were waiting. They knew the stage route. They were not Apache. They were white men, dressed in scraps of leather, painted." "Why?" "To keep the fire burning," Koyani said, his voice low. "My people are on the reservation. We signed a treaty. There is a man, a Captain Graham. He wants the treaty broken. He wants the land." Elena felt a chill. The army. "I was a scout for them," Koyani said, a bitter taste in his words. "I did it to keep the peace. I showed them the water holes. I kept the miners safe from my own cousins. I did it for the treaty." "What happened?" "Graham betrayed it. He needed a reason to bring the soldiers back. He arranged the killing of an officer, a man who argued for the treaty. He used my knife, stolen, to make it look like my work. I have been running ever since. He stopped, his breathing tight. He reached inside his boot, his face a mask of pain as he strained. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, stained with his own blood. He handed it to her. It was a voucher, a receipt for 10 cases of gunpowder and a dozen Henry rifles, purchased from the town general store. At the bottom, authorizing the payment for territory defense, was a signature she knew well. It was the same signature on the overdue mortgage for her own ranch. P.R. Prescott. Elena's blood ran cold. Prescott, the banker, the man who owned the Dusty Lily, the man who paid Sheriff Mace, the man who spoke of civilization and order. He was funding the raiders. The ambush at Cottonwood Creek was not a robbery, she realized. It was a setup. They were killing witnesses. And Koyani, the man they were already hunting, was the perfect person to blame. She had to go to town the next day. She needed more laudanum and salt. The ranch felt small, the canyon walls too close. The knowledge of Prescott's involvement was a heavy weight. The town was different. It was not just wary, it was angry. A crowd of about 30 men, miners and ranch hands, was gathered on the boardwalk outside the Dusty Lily. They were listening to a man on a wagon bed. "We need to sweep them out," the man shouted, his face red. "We need to protect our families." Sheriff Mace was there, leaning against a post, his arms crossed. He looked tired. He saw Elena tying her mare and pushed off the post, walking over to her. "Miss Hart, you should not be in town. It is not safe." "What is happening, Mace?" Mace rubbed his face. "Prescott is organizing a citizens' posse. He wants this settled before the circuit judge gets here." "Settled how?" Mace looked away, toward the bank's imposing front. "He just wants it settled. Miss Hart, he wants the Apache blamed, publicly." He lowered his voice. "Go home, and stay there." It was a warning, but it felt weak, like a prayer in a windstorm. He was a man caught in a trap, and Elena knew Prescott held the key. She got her supplies and rode hard, the sky turning a strange, sickly yellow. The wind, the voice Koyani had taught her to hear, was rising to a howl. She saw the storm coming from the west, a solid wall of brown grit that blotted out the sun. It was a sandstorm, one of the bad ones. She urged the mare into a desperate run, the world disappearing behind her. She reached the ranch just as the first wave hit, a force so strong it nearly pushed the horse to its knees. She wrestled the stable door open, pulled the mare inside, and slammed it shut, the sound lost in the deafening roar. She ran, bent double against the gale, to the old stable. She threw herself through the doorway, coughing, her eyes and lungs full of sand. The world went dark. Koyani was in the corner, a blanket pulled over his head. The air was thick, unbreathable. And the sound? It was a scream, a high, thin wail as the wind tore at the loose sheets of tin on the roof. The stone walls groaned. It sounded like the world was ending. They were trapped. For hours, they sat in the roaring dark, just feet apart. The storm scrubbed the world clean, reducing everything to the shriek of the wind and the grit between their teeth. When the sound finally began to die down, hours later, the air was icy cold. Elena fumbled for her lantern, her hands shaking. The small flame was a miracle. Koyani was pale, shivering. The cold was bad for him. Elena unhooked her canteen. She still had coffee from that morning. It was cold, thick as mud, and bitter. She poured some into a tin cup and handed it to him. "It is all I have." He looked at the black liquid. He sipped it. His entire body convulsed. He choked, a dry, racking cough that shook his wounded shoulder. His eyes watered. Elena almost smiled. "Is it that bad?" He looked at the cup, then at her, his dark eyes holding a flicker of something she had not seen before, a faint, painful spark of humor. He whispered, This could defeat a sandstorm. She let out a small laugh, a sound that surprised her. The tension that had held her for days finally broke. Just a little. The next morning, the world was scoured new, buried under a fine layer of yellow dust. The ranch was quiet, the air still. Koyani was on his feet, unsteady but upright. He was examining the well pump, now choked with sand. With his good hand, he pointed. You must clear the gear mechanism. This is how. He was showing her how to reseat the repaired fan gear when they heard the horse. Elena tensed, her hand dropping to her peacemaker. A lone rider, coming fast. A boy, lanky, covered in dust, slumped in the saddle with exhaustion. Nate, Elena breathed. Her brother, 16 years old. He was supposed to be in Texas, working a cattle drive. He slid off his horse, his face a mess of confusion. Elena, he said, his voice cracking. He stared past her, into the shadows of the yard, at Koyani. Nate's eyes went wide. His hand fumbled for the small pistol at his belt. Elena, that is an Apache. His name is Koyani, Elena said, stepping in front of her brother. He is hurt. Nate's face hardened. The town's poison mixing with his boyhood fear. They say they killed Silas. They say an Apache murdered those men at the creek. Koyani stepped out of the shadow of the stable, into the clear morning light. He did not look at Nate's gun. He looked at the boy. He saw the fear. He saw the cheap, frayed rope on Nate's saddle. He stepped forward. Nate flinched, raising the pistol. Koyani ignored it. He took the end of the boy's rope in his one good hand. He moved slowly, deliberately. His fingers twisted the rope, looping and pulling it, his movements a blur of economy. In seconds, he had tied a complex, beautiful knot, a knot that could hold a heavy load or secure a restless horse, a knot for survival. He pushed the rope back toward the boy. Then, Koyani did something that made Elena's heart stop. He unhooked his own knife, the bird and fire knife. From his belt, he held it out to Nate. Handle first. A man who is taught, Koyani said, his voice quiet but carrying in the still air, is stronger than a man who only fears. Nate stared at the knife, the weapon, the symbol. He looked at his sister, then back at the Apache who was supposed to be a devil. Slowly, his trembling hand reached out and took the knife. Nate stood in the dust of the yard, the antler knife heavy in his hand. He was 16, poised awkwardly between the boy he was and the man he was trying to be. He looked at the knife, the bird in the flames, and then at Koyani, who stood, weak but upright, by the ruined stable. The Apache's gaze was steady, holding no judgment, only a deep, profound weariness. Martha Hart burst from the house, her face a mask of pale horror. She saw the knife. She saw her son holding it. She grabbed Nate's arm, trying to pull him away, as if the man was a sickness. Elena, she said, her voice a strained whisper. This is madness. You have brought a curse on this house. Nate pulled his arm free. He did not look at his mother. He looked at Koyani. He said he was not a murderer. Martha reeled, as if struck. Elena stepped between them, her own exhaustion a heavy cloak. Ma, go inside. Nate, check the south fence line. The storm may have loosened the posts. She was giving him an order, a chore, something to anchor him. She was also getting him away from the house, away from their mother's fear. Nate nodded, grateful. He slid the knife into his own belt, a decision that made Martha gasp, and went to saddle his horse. Elena turned to Koyani. You should rest. You use too much strength. He nodded, retreating into the shadows of the old stable. He said the boy was strong, but his fear was a whip. An hour later, Elena was scrubbing the soot from her hands when she heard the horses. It was not a single rider. It was a group. She dried her hands, her heart a cold knot. Koyani was hidden. She walked onto the porch just as Sheriff Mace reined in, 2 deputies flanking him, Mace did not look like a man in charge. He looked like a man being led. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice flat. He did not tip his hat. "Sheriff," Elena replied, her tone just as flat. "More storm damage." Mace's eyes scanned the yard, lingering on the fresh boot prints around the old stable. He dismounted. "I am not here about the storm. Prescott has put up a new reward, $500. "For what?" Mace looked uncomfortable. He pulled a fresh poster from his saddlebag. It was new, the ink still dark. It accused the Apache, Koyani, of the stage attack, and now of stealing a shipment of bank gold. "Gold," Elena said. "That is new." Mace shrugged, avoiding her eyes. "It means the bounty hunters will be thick as flies. I have to do a search. Miss Hart, a formal one." Elena fought to keep her breathing steady. She had moved Koyani from the stable. It was the first place they would look. He was in the house, in the tiny, dark root cellar beneath the kitchen floor, hidden under a stack of empty potato sacks. "Of course, Sheriff," Elena said, forcing a calm she did not feel. "Would you like some coffee while you look?" Mace almost grimaced, remembering her coffee, but he nodded. It was part of the ritual. She led him inside. She poured him a cup of the thick, bitter liquid. He took a sip and his eyes watered, just as Koyani's had. She played the part of the exhausted, slightly annoyed rancher. She told him his deputies could check the barns. She pointed out the storm damage to the main roof. She complained about the well pump, though Koyani had fixed it. She was talking, filling the silence, drawing his attention to every mundane detail, every leak and crack. One deputy went to the main barn. The other, younger one, went to the old stable. Elena's heart pounded against her ribs. She was standing directly on the trap door that led to the cellar. Mace stared into his cup. "This is a bad business," he said, his voice low. "Meant only for her." She waited. "Prescott is pushing this hard. He wants the Apache, but the tracks at the creek were wrong." "How wrong?" "Too heavy," Mace said, "too clumsy." This was not a Chiricahua scout. It was a brawl. He leaned closer. He said he thought it was Red Jack's gang. Elena's blood froze. Red Jack, a brutal, simple man who led a band of ex-miners and army deserters. Mace continued. "Red Jack is a blunt instrument, not a ghost, but someone is painting him to look like one. And now there is gold missing. Prescott is raising a storm. Miss Hart, and he is pointing it right at the reservations." The deputy returned from the old stable. He shook his head. "Nothing. Sheriff, just old ashes." The other deputy came back from the barn. Just a mare and some hay. Mace finished his coffee, his face grim. He stood. "Thank you for the courtesy. Miss Hart." He walked to the door and paused. He advised her to stay clear of town. He said the men looking for this $500 would not be polite. They would not knock. Elena locked the door behind them and waited a full 5 minutes before she moved the rug and lifted the heavy trap door. Koyani was coiled in the darkness, his good hand on his knife. "You heard," she whispered. He nodded, climbing out. His shoulder was tight with pain. Red Jack. The name, Elena said, tasted like rust. They did not have to wait long. The attack came 2 nights later. Mace was right. They did not knock. The first sound was a rifle shot that shattered the kitchen window, sending glass and pottery flying. Martha screamed. Elena was already moving, grabbing her peacemaker from the mantel and shoving her mother toward the root cellar. Another shot hit the door, the wood splintering. "Nate," Elena yelled, "get your rifle." Koyani was already at the window, peering through a crack in the frame. He was calm. He counted. 4 of them, maybe 5. They are clumsy. They are shooting at the light. The men outside were shouting, calling for the Apache, demanding the money. They were bounty hunters, drunk on the promise of Prescott's gold. Koyani looked at Elena. His wound was bleeding again, a dark stain spreading on his shirt. But his eyes were clear. "They are not smart," he told her. "They are loud. They want the money, not a war." He pointed to the pantry, the flour, the cornmeal. A plan formed, desperate and sharp. Koyani told her they must be blinded. "Nate," Elena ordered, her voice low and urgent. "Go out the back window. Circle around to the corral. When I shout, make noise, throw rocks at the tin roof of the barn. Be the ghost they are looking for." Nate looked terrified, but he nodded. His new knife at his belt, he disappeared into the darkness. Elena grabbed 2 large sacks of cornmeal from the pantry. Koyani watched her, his back against the wall, his own rifle in his lap. He could not lift it to shoot, but he was loading it for her. He told her to wait for their volley. They shoot, then they move. Elena waited, her heart pounding. The men fired again, a ragged volley that thudded into the sod walls of the house. "Now," Koyani said. Elena ran to the shattered window. Nate, from the darkness of the corral, began to hammer a loose piece of tin, a terrible, crashing racket. The men outside swore, turning toward the new sound. They fired into the darkness of the barn. That was Elena's chance. With all her strength, she threw the heavy sacks of cornmeal out the window. Aiming high, the sacks burst, one after the other, sending a massive cloud of fine, pale dust into the night air. The cloud hung in the moonlight, thick as fog, and then settled. The coughing started immediately. The men were blinded, sputtering, the gritty meal in their eyes, their lungs. Koyani, from the window, threw a stone hard against the side of the water trough, making it sound like a man landing heavily on the ground. He was faking their footsteps, pulling the hunters in different directions. "They are blind," Elena whispered. The men panicked. They were shooting at shadows, at sounds. One of them screamed that it was a trap. They fired wildly, at the house, at the barn, at the empty air. "We are leaving," one of them shouted, his voice thick with dust and fear. They heard the men crashing through the brush, finding their horses, their movements clumsy and desperate. In a minute, there was only the sound of hoofbeats fading fast into the night. Silence returned. "Elena," Nate's voice called from the darkness. "It is safe," she called back. "They are gone." She lit a lantern, her hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries. Nate climbed back through the window, his face pale, but his eyes bright with adrenaline. She turned to her mother, who was huddled at the cellar door. "Ma, it is all right." Martha did not move. She was staring at her arm. A long, dark splinter of wood from the window frame was embedded in her forearm, and it was bleeding. One of the first bullets had sent it flying like an arrow. Elena rushed to her, gently pulling the wood free. It was not deep, a light wound. But as Elena looked up, she saw her mother's eyes were not on the blood. They were wide, fixed on the outside. "Fire," Martha whispered, the word a small, dead sound. Nate smelled it too. Smoke. Elena ran outside. One of the last wild shots from the retreating hunters had found the hay barn. Not the old, ruined stable, but their new one, the one filled with the winter feed. A small, orange flame was licking up the dry siding. "The fire motif?" the threat returned. "No," Elena said. Nate grabbed the buckets from the well. Koyani was already there, his one good hand working the pump handle, the handle he had helped fix. For an hour, they fought it. Elena, Nate, and Koyani, a desperate, frantic line, throwing water on the growing flames. Even Martha, her arm wrapped in a rag, joined them, her face a pale, grim mask, her movement stiff with the memory of another fire. They saved the barn, but a whole section of the wall was gone, a black, gaping wound, and the smell of wet ashes and fear choked the air. They collapsed by the well as the first pale light of dawn touched the mesas. They were covered in soot, exhausted, and bleeding in small ways. Elena looked at Koyani. His shoulder was soaked. He had torn the wound open again. She sat next to him, her voice hollow. "You have to leave." He did not look at her. He watched the last of the smoke curl into the sky. "They almost killed us," Elena said, her voice shaking with a cold rage. "My mother is hurt. They set my barn on fire. We cannot protect you." He finally turned to her. His dark eyes were filled with a pain that had nothing to do with his shoulder. "Running is what Graham wants. It is what Prescott wants. If I run, I am the ghost they invented. I am the murderer." He looked at the smoking ruins. "I will not run from the truth." Before Elena could answer, Nate shouted. He was pointing toward the road. A single rider. It was Sheriff Mace. He rode into the yard slowly, his face unreadable. He took in the shattered window, the blood on Martha's sleeve, the smoking barn, and the three of them, soot-stained and weary. He stopped in front of Koyani, who did not move, who just stood, meeting his gaze. Mace sighed. It was the sound of a man at the end of his rope. Elena walked straight up to him. She was past lying. She was past playing innocent. She pulled the folded, blood-stained voucher from her pocket, the one Koyani had given her, the one signed by Prescott. She held it up to him. She asked him if this was the order he was following. Mace stared at the paper. His face, already pale, went white. Nate stepped forward, his fear gone, replaced by a hard, boyish anger. He threw the bolt of fake Apache cloth at the sheriff's feet. It unrolled in the dust, a splash of garish, cheap color. He told Mace he found Red Jack's camp in Mesquite Canyon. He showed him the blank wanted posters. He told Mace that this was Red Jack's work, and Prescott was paying for it. Mace looked at the voucher in Elena's hand. He looked at the fake cloth on the ground. He looked at Koyani, a man he was supposed to arrest, a man who had clearly just fought to save this ranch. He was trapped. Elena could see it. The bank, the mortgage, the town. Prescott owned his badge. He looked at Elena, his eyes full of a misery she had not thought him capable of. He opened his mouth, as if to speak. Then he closed it, without a word. Sheriff Mace turned his horse. He kicked it into a slow trot, riding away from the evidence, away from the smoking barn, away from the truth. He rode back toward the town that Prescott owned, leaving them completely, terribly alone. The silence Sheriff Mace left behind was louder than the bounty hunters' rifles. It was a hollow, echoing void that confirmed they were truly alone. The law had looked at the truth, weighed it against a bank ledger, and ridden away. Martha Hart retreated into the house, her face a mask of old grief made new. She did not speak to Elena. She just began to clean the soot from the windowsill, her movements small and brittle. Koyani stood by the well, his shirt stiff with his own dried blood. He looked at Nate, who was still holding the blank wanted posters. Then he looked at Elena. "Mace is gone," Elena said, her voice flat. "He was never here," Koyani replied. "He is a shadow cast by Prescott." They could not stay. The bounty hunters were clumsy, but they were also numerous. They would be back, emboldened by the lack of reprisal. "We must move," Koyani said. "Now." His shoulder was a knot of agony, but his eyes were clear. "Where?" Elena asked, her practicality bordering on despair. "There is nowhere." He walked, his steps measured and slightly uneven. To the road, he knelt, ignoring the pain, his gaze fixed on the churned-up dust where the hunters had fled. He spent a long time studying the ground, his fingers gently tracing the edge of a hoofprint. "Nate, come," Koyani called. Nate walked over, his initial fear of Koyani now completely replaced by a tense, focused admiration. Koyani pointed. "See this? This horse is heavy. This one is light, running scared." He moved further. "And this one, he is the leader." He pointed to a single, clear print. The front right hoof, the rim of the iron shoe was clear, but one nailhead was missing. The ground showed a small, smooth divot where the nail should have been. "I saw this track at Mesquite Canyon," Koyani said, his voice quiet. "At Red Jack's camp. He did not ride with the others. He circled. He watched. He is the one who led them here. The leader, Elena said, Red Jack himself. We follow him. Koyani said, he will lead us to the rest of the proof. This was a different kind of madness, but it felt more solid than waiting to be burned alive. Ma, Elena said, walking back to the house. Martha did not look up from her scrubbing. We are leaving. We are going to find the men who did this. Martha's hands stopped. She finally looked at her daughter, her eyes wide and pleading. Elena, let the law handle it. The law just left. You cannot, Martha whispered. You are a woman. He is... She could not say the word. Nate is just a boy. You will die in the desert. Elena knelt in front of her mother. She took the sooty rag from her hand. Ma, if we stay, we die here. They will come back, and they will finish it. This is the only way. This is not about revenge. It is about survival. She saw the fight go out of her mother's eyes, replaced by a devastating emptiness. Martha nodded. Once, she turned and went to the kitchen. She began to pack food. Dried beef, cornmeal, a full canteen. It was her surrender. They left within the hour. 3 riders, 2 horses and a mule. Slipping out of the canyon as the sun began to climb, Koyani, his shoulder freshly bandaged, rode with Nate. Elena led the mule, loaded with their meager supplies. They did not take the road. They followed the high ridge, melting into the rocks and scrub, following a single, flawed hoof print that only Koyani could see. The land was a brutal negotiator. It demanded everything. Koyani, though weakened, was its master. Elena and Nate were merely its pupils. The trail of the flawed hoof print led them away from the town, deep into the high, broken country. You are walking too loud, Koyani told Nate on the second day. The ground was hard-pan clay, cracked like a broken plate. You let your heel strike first. You tell the stones you are here. Walk as if you are part of the wind, not fighting it. He showed Nate how to read the broken trail. A pebble turned over, its damp side up, a bent blade of grass in the shelter of a rock, a single horsehair caught on a mesquite thorn. It was a language Elena had never known existed, and Koyani read it like a book. The nights were the worst. The high desert cold seeped into their bones. They could not risk a large fire. The first night, they huddled in a narrow arroyo, chewing on dry beef, sharing a single blanket. They were low on water. The canteen Martha had packed was half empty. Elena, practical as ever, rationed it, a mouthful each, every 3 hours. Koyani stopped in a dry, sandy wash. He pointed to a patch of damp-looking sand near a cluster of willow. Dig, he told Nate. Nate dug, first with his hands, then with the knife Koyani had given him. 3 feet down, the sand became dark mud. A few minutes later, a small, silty puddle formed at the bottom. It was not clean, but it was water. They let it settle, then refilled the canteen, the water tasting of earth and minerals. That night, Koyani disappeared into the dusk. He returned an hour later with a rabbit. He had set a snare of horsehair and a bent twig. He showed them how to build a Dakota fire, a small fire in a deep hole. So the smoke was dispersed and the light invisible. They cooked the meat, and the simple, hot meal felt like a feast. On the 3rd day, the trail led them back toward the town. Koy, what is this? This is not good. Why is he going back to town? He is not going to town. He is going to the high ground above it. They needed information. The market fair was in 2 days. Koyani knew it. It was a gathering, a place for Prescott to make his move. We cannot go in, Elena said. They are hunting you, and now they will be hunting us. I must go, Elena said. Koyani shook his head. No, you are a target. Nate stepped forward. I can go. I'm just a boy. No one will look at me. Elena looked at her brother. The dust and the sun had burned his face. The fear was gone. In its place was a man's resolve. He was right. No, Elena said. You do not know who to ask. I will go, but not to the town. I will go to the Dusty Lily. Koyani tensed. The saloon. Prescott's saloon. It is Prescott's, yes, Elena said, but it is run by Maria Valdez. Maria Valdez was a legend. She had come from Santa Fe with nothing and now ran the most profitable and most dangerous establishment in the county. She was in her 40s, with striking gray eyes and a mind as sharp as a boot knife. She served whiskey to Prescott, to Mace, to the bounty hunters, and to the miners. She listened, she remembered, and she sold what she knew. She was not loyal to Prescott. She was loyal to her ledger. That night, Elena slipped away. She left Koyani and Nate camped in the hills and walked the 2 miles to the back of the town. The Dusty Lily was loud, a piano clashing with rough laughter. She did not go in the front. She went to the back door, where Maria took her deliveries. Maria herself opened the door, a double-barreled shotgun resting in the crook of her arm. She saw Elena, covered in dust, her hair tied back like a man's, and did not blink. Her gray eyes scanned the darkness behind Elena. You are late for evening service, Miss Hart, and you are not dressed for it. I need to talk to you, Maria. Maria Valdez stared at her for a long moment, then stepped aside. Come in, but not the gun. Elena unbuckled her peacemaker and handed it to her. Maria took it, weighed it, and set it on a high shelf. She led Elena into a small, quiet office behind the bar. The noise of the saloon suddenly muffled. The room smelled of cigar smoke and expensive perfume. You are the most wanted woman in the territory right now, Maria said, pouring 2 small glasses of brandy. Prescott is furious. He says you are harboring his property. He is not property, Elena said. He is a man. Maria smiled, a thin, humorless expression. To Prescott, everything is property, especially the men he pays. You are costing him a great deal of trouble. I have proof, Elena said. Proof he is funding Red Jack. Proof he faked the robbery. Maria sipped her brandy. Proof is a dangerous thing. Child, it is heavier than gold and more deadly than a bullet. What do you want from me? What is Prescott planning? For the market fair. Maria looked at her, her gray eyes seeming to count every secret Elena held. He is planning a closing argument. He has men riding in from 3 counties. He is going to present his evidence to the circuit judge. He is going to demand the army be sent in to clean out the Chiricahua, once and for all. He wants a war. It is good for his bank. Elena felt cold, and if he does not get it... Maria leaned forward. When a man like Prescott closes a case, Elena, he burns the file. You understand me? He has moved a wagon load of blasting powder into the old assay office by the market square. He is not planning for a long trial. He is going to burn the town, Elena whispered, and blame the Apache. Maria nodded. He will close all his accounts at once. She looked at Elena, a flicker of something, maybe pity in her eyes. You are in love with him, are you not? The Apache. Elena thought of the man who hated her coffee, the man who taught her to read the wind, the man who had stood his ground against fire. Not yet, Elena said, picking up the brandy, but I like the way he hates my coffee. Maria laughed, a short, sharp bark. Get out of here, and do not come back. She handed Elena her gun, but she added, as Elena opened the door, he is not the only one. Red Jack has a custom, Henry. It jams. He is always cursing it. Elena slipped back into the night, her mind racing. A custom, Henry. She got back to the camp before dawn. Koyani and Nate were waiting, their faces carved from shadow. She told them what Maria had said. Fire, Koyani said, the word a bitter taste. He always uses fire. Nate, who had been sifting through the last of the debris from Red Jack's camp, held up his hand. I found this. It was a small piece of dark, tooled metal, intricately shaped, a piece of a trigger guard. Koyani took it. He recognized the pattern. He had seen it on Red Jack's rifle, just before the ambush. Elena's hand went to her pocket. She pulled out the small, lead-smeared piece of shrapnel she had dug from the stagecoach door at Cottonwood Creek, the piece she had kept as a grim souvenir. She held it next to the trigger guard. The dark, tooled metal piece fit into the lead-smeared fragment perfectly. It was the piece that had broken off when Red Jack's rifle had jammed during the attack, shattering and spraying the coach. "This is it," Elena whispered. "This connects Red Jack with his custom rifle to the ambush." They had the voucher, they had the fake cloth, they had the piece of the gun. They sat in the pre-dawn chill, the evidence in their hands. It was heavy. Elena looked at the ranch, a dark shape in the valley below. She thought of her mother, alone, waiting. She thought of the fire, the hatred, the easy lies. She looked at Nate, who had aged 5 years in 3 days. Then she looked at Koyani. He was watching her, his face a mask of exhaustion and pain. "You should not go," he said, his voice low. "This is not your fight. You and the boy take your mother and ride east." Elena looked at him, at the man who had been hunted, betrayed, shot, and burned, but who had not run. "I am saving a man, Koyana, not his color." She said the words back to him. "I am not done yet." He held her gaze. He saw the stubborn, practical, unbreakable core of her. He saw the woman who made coffee that could defeat a sandstorm. He nodded. "Once. Then we will show them," he said. "Not in the dark. In the light. At the market. We will show them all." They made the vow, a quiet promise in the cold dark. As they sat, a new scent touched the air. It was not the dry smell of dust. It was the rich, clean smell of moisture, the smell Koyani had taught her to recognize. A single, cold drop of water hit Elena's hand, then another. She looked up. The sky had broken open. It was not the violent rage of the sandstorm. It was a slow, steady, soaking rain. The first rain of the season. It washed the dust from the air, the soot from the rocks. It dripped from the brim of Elena's hat, tasting of clean earth and new beginnings. It was the opposite of fire. It was a promise. They sat in the open, letting it wash over them, a quiet, cold blessing before the battle to come. The rain was not a blessing. It was a cold, hard, driving assault, turning the hillside to slick mud and the air to ice. They had managed to stretch a heavy canvas tarp, a relic from the burnt barn, between 2 low-growing junipers and a slab of rock. It was less a tent and more of a slanted roof, a small triangle of comparative dryness in a drowning world. Nate was already asleep, wrapped in his own bedroll and pushed into the driest corner against the rock. He was 16, and he had seen too much. The journey, the fear, and the final steady purpose had exhausted him. He had eaten his share of the cold rabbit and collapsed, his breathing the only sound besides the storm. The fire was small, a handful of twigs sputtering on a flat stone, producing more pale smoke than heat. Koyani and Elena sat near it, their knees almost touching. The world had shrunk to the space of this small shelter, the rhythmic drumming of water on the canvas 1,000 miles away from the world of men, banks, and fire. They had their wet cloaks hung on a low branch, dripping steadily. They were both drying their socks, turning them over the meager flame. Steam rose from the damp wool, carrying the scent of sweat, wet earth, and wood smoke. Koyani was staring into the fire, his face carved in shadow and weak orange light. His wounded shoulder was pulled in tight, the cold aggravating the injury. He was silent, but his silence was different from the kind Elena was used to. It was not empty, it was full. "You are thinking of something far away," she said, her voice quiet, almost lost in the rain. He did not look at her. He watched a drop of water hiss as it fell from a leak onto the fire. "This rain," he said. His voice was a low rasp. "It reminds me of the long walk. Not mine, my grandmother's. But we had our own." He paused, and Elena waited. She knew this was a door opening, one that was rarely unlocked. When they moved us, he continued, his gaze still on the flame. It was cold. We did not have canvas. We had army blankets. They were thin. They held the water and the ice. My sister, she was small. Her name was Ayana. He traced a line on the dirt floor. She had a cough. It started in her chest. The soldier, the one who was a doctor, he said she needed to be dry. He said it as if he were ordering a new pair of boots. Koyani's good hand clenched into a fist. She died on the third night of the rain. We buried her under a wet blanket because the ground was too hard to dig. She was 8. He fell silent. The drumming of the rain filled the space his words had left. Elena felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the night. She saw the small, rigid form under a wet blanket. A story she had only heard in whispers, now sitting beside her, breathing her air. "That is why you fight them," she said, not a question, a statement. He finally turned to look at her. His dark eyes were not angry. They were filled with a profound, ancient sadness. "I fight because I am tired of being cold," he said. "I fight because they think a piece of paper, a treaty, is worth more than a life. Prescott, Graham, they are the same man. They just use different words. They want the land. They do not care who is buried under it." Elena watched the steam rise from her own sock. "The fire. My father." Koyani waited. He gave her the same silence she had given him. "He was a good man," she said, her voice thick. "He was not a fighter. He was not a politician. He loved horses. He could gentle a wild mare just by talking to Beep. See, and blowing in her nose. He smelled of leather and sweet feed." She looked down at her own hands, chapped and strong. "These are his hands." When the fire came, I was in town with Ma, buying seed. We saw the smoke. By the time we got back, the old stable, it was just gone. The horses were screaming, and he was inside. He had gone back to try and save them. "Kato saved them," Koyani said, understanding. She nodded, a tear tracing a clean path through the soot on her cheek. "We found him, afterward. The smell, burning hay and—" She stopped. Koyani's hand, his good one, moved. It did not touch her. It just rested on the ground between them, palm up, an offering. She took a shaky breath. That was not the worst part. The worst part was the next day. The whispers. The men who came by, not to help, but to look. They stood by the ashes. They said it was Apache. They said a raiding party had been seen. They said they were crazy, burning for the sake of burning. Her voice dropped to a bitter whisper. My mother, she heard them. She believes them. She has to, because if it was not the Apache, then it was just nothing. A random spark, an accident, and she cannot live with that. The hatred, it gives the pain a shape. She looked at Koyani, her eyes fierce. The fire took my father, but the rumor, the lie, that is what took my mother from me. They sat in the shared darkness, their two ghosts huddled between them. An 8-year-old girl in a wet grave, a horse gentler in an ash-filled barn. The same lie, the same greed had created both. The fire sputtered, casting a weak, bluish light. The rain found a new hole in the tarp, and a steady drip began near Elena's foot. She shivered, a deep, bone-rattling tremor that shook her whole body. Her clothes were not wet, but they were damp, and the cold was winning. Koyani watched her. He looked at his own blanket, the one he had kept dry with a piece of oilcloth. It was thick wool, woven by his grandmother. "You are cold," he said. "I am fine." Her teeth chattered, betraying the lie. "You are a bad liar," he said, a shadow of a smile in his voice. He shifted, making space beside him on the dry patch of ground. He did not say anything more. He just waited. Elena looked at him. She looked at the blanket. She looked at Nate, who was deeply, blessedly asleep. This was a line. a line drawn in the mud by culture, by fear, by 100 years of war. He was Apache. She was white. He was the man her mother blamed for her father's death. He was the man she had saved. And tomorrow they were walking into a firestorm, perhaps to die. The tremor seized her again. This was not about politics. This was about survival. She began to unlace her heavy, mud-caked boots. She pulled them off. Her feet were pale and cold. She started to unbutton her damp canvas jacket. She was shivering, her hands fumbling with the buttons. She stopped, her hand at her throat. She looked at him, her eyes wide in the gloom, vulnerable and defiant all at once. She bit her lip, and a small, shaky laugh escaped her.
"What happens after I undress?"
Koyane's face softened. The deep lines of pain and grief eased. A slow, gentle smile touched his mouth, a smile that reached his eyes and lit them from within. He held her gaze, his voice calm and steady, a rock in the storm. "Then you will know, Desire." The words hung in the air, simple, profound, and absolutely true. It was not a threat. It was not a promise of crude passion. It was a promise of understanding, of warmth, of a connection that went deeper than skin. Elena took a breath. She slipped off the damp jacket, leaving her in her thin cotton shirt. The cold hit her, and she moved, quickly, sliding onto the ground beside him. He lifted the heavy blanket, and she moved under it, into the sudden, shocking cloud of his warmth. He smelled of pine smoke, of the desert, of himself. He was solid and real beside her. He wrapped the blanket around them both, pulling it tight against the cold. They sat side by side, shoulder to shoulder. His wounded side was away from her. His good arm was around her, holding the blanket in place. She leaned her head against his shoulder. It was a gesture of profound exhaustion and profound trust. He did not move. He just held her, breathing in the scent of her hair, which smelled of rain and soap. After a long time, he shifted. His hand, the one that had lain open between them, came up. He touched her chin, tilting her face toward his. In the near darkness, lit only by the dying embers of the fire, he looked at her. He saw the strength. He saw the fear she fought. He saw the woman who had saved him. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a hurried, desperate kiss. It was slow. It was deep. It was a kiss of gratitude, of recognition, of a shared vow. It tasted of rain and smoke and the faintest hint of the bitter coffee they both remembered. It was a long, quiet confirmation that they were both alive, both human, and both, in this moment, safe. When they broke apart, they did not speak. He did not pull her down. She did not press for more. It was, as the outline had stated, enough. Trust had been sealed. Their hands found each other under the blanket, fingers lacing together, a tight, warm grip against the night. The firelight reflected on their joined skin. They sat like that for a long time. Two cultures, two histories, wrapped in a single blanket, listening to the rain die down.
"Elena,"
her voice a sleepy murmur against his shirt, broke the silence.
"But tomorrow,"
she whispered. He waited.
"I am still not making the coffee any weaker."
He let out a very quiet laugh, a warm puff of air in her hair. "Good," he whispered back. "I will need something to wake the thunder." They fell silent again. The rain softened to a drip. The fire was nothing but a few red coals. Outside the shelter, the world was washed clean and waiting. Tomorrow, they would face the market. Tomorrow, they would face Prescott and the fire. But tonight, they were just two people, sharing a blanket, holding on. The morning of the market fair was unnaturally clean. The rain had passed, leaving the air cold and sharp, scrubbing the sky to a pale, brittle blue. The mud in the street was thick, but the townsfolk had laid down boards, creating a network of walkways. The square was full, a bright, false bloom of activity. Tents were pitched, selling pies and tools. Ranchers haggled over livestock. Miners, flush with a small strike, were already crowding the doors of the Dusty Lily. Elena, Koyani, and Nate did not walk in from the main road. They came up from the creek, moving through the alley behind the livery, their movements careful and planned. Koyani's shoulder was a solid knot of agony under his shirt, which was clean. One of Nate's. Elena had rebound the wound, but the cold and the long night had taken their toll. He moved stiffly, but he moved. Elena's peacemaker was at her hip, every chamber loaded. Nate, walking between them, had the trigger guard, the fake cloth, and the voucher tucked deep in his pockets. His face was set in a hard, adult line. They saw the platform first. It was new, built of raw pine, standing in front of Prescott's bank, and Prescott was on it. He was dressed in a fine black suit, his voice rolling over the crowd. He was not talking about interest rates. He was talking about civilization. "We build," he proclaimed, his hands sweeping to encompass the town. "We build order from chaos. We bring progress to this wilderness. But that progress is threatened. Our families are threatened. The stagecoach, our connection to the east, was attacked. Its driver murdered. Our gold, the lifeblood of our prosperity, was stolen." A murmur went through the crowd. They were hooked by a savage, relentless shadow. Prescott continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial rumble. "A shadow that burns and kills without reason. The Apache." Elena felt Koyani tense beside her. He was scanning the crowd, his eyes missing nothing. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod toward the assay office. Across the square, a large man in a filthy duster, a thick beard covering his face, leaned against the wall. He was watching Prescott, a small, cruel smile on his lips. It was Red Jack. He was hiding in plain sight, enjoying the show. "And I say," Prescott yelled, "we must cut this shadow out. We must petition the army. We must demand they finish the job, that they secure this territory for the decent folk who work it." Sheriff Mace was on the edge of the crowd, near the saloon. He looked trapped, his hands clasped behind his back, his face miserable. He was a man watching his own irrelevance. Then, the door of the Dusty Lily opened. Maria Valdez stepped out. She was not dressed for a market. She was dressed for business, in a severe black skirt. She carried a leather-bound ledger. The crowd was fixated on Prescott. No one saw her. No one except Elena and Koyani. Maria walked directly to Sheriff Mace. She did not raise her voice. She did not make a scene. She said something to him, her face calm. Then she held out the ledger. Mace looked at her, confused. He took the book. He opened it. Elena watched his face. It was a study in collapse. His shoulders slumped, his skin, already pale, turned the color of ash. He stared at a page, his finger tracing a line. He looked up, his gaze finding Red Jack by the assay office. Then he looked at Prescott on the platform. Then he looked back at the ledger. Maria Valdez had just handed him the truth. The payments, the gunpowder, the names. She turned, without a backward glance, and walked back into her saloon, the double door swinging shut behind her. Her part was done. On the platform, Prescott was raising his arms for a final, patriotic flourish. We must stand together, for the future, for civilization. That is when Elena stepped out of the alley. She walked into the open square, her boots sinking into the mud. The crowd turned, startled. She stopped, 20 feet from the platform, and her voice, clear and cold, cut through the applause. "What civilization, Mr. Prescott, the one you pay for with blood?" The square went utterly silent. Prescott froze, his arms still in the air. "Who is that?" someone whispered. "It is the Heart Girl, the one who ran off." Prescott lowered his arms. He forced a thin, paternal smile. "Miss Hart, you are confused. You have been through a terrible ordeal." Elena shook her head. "I am not confused. I am not distraught. I am here to tell the truth." Koyani stepped out, standing beside her. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. "An Apache! The murderer!" "Look!" a man yelled. "It is him. He has got the Hart girl hostage." "She is not my hostage," Koyani said, his voice quiet, but it carried in the silence. "She saved my life." Prescott's smile vanished. His eyes went flat and cold. "Sheriff Mace," he commanded, "do your duty. Arrest that killer." Mace did not move. He was still staring at the open ledger in his hand, as if it were a snake. "He is not the killer," Elena said, her voice growing stronger. She pointed, her hands shaking but her fingers steady. "Straight at Red Jack. He is—" Red Jack stopped smiling. He pushed himself off the wall, his hand moving toward the custom rifle he was holding. "The men who attacked the stagecoach were not Apache," Elena shouted, turning to the crowd. "They were white men, dressed up." Nate stepped out then, standing with his sister. He reached into his pocket and threw the wad of fake, brightly colored cloth onto the muddy boards. It unrolled, a garish lie. "Like this," Nate said, his voice cracking but loud. "I found their camp at Mesquite Canyon. They had a stack of this, and blank wanted posters." Prescott laughed. "A harsh, barking sound. This is absurd. A boy's story. Sheriff, I will not tolerate this." "And I found this," Elena said. She held up the small, dark piece of tooled metal, the trigger guard from Red Jack's rifle. She held up the other piece, the lead-smeared fragment. "And this, I dug this from the door of the stagecoach. They fit." She slammed the two pieces together in her palm, a perfect match. Red Jack's face was now a mask of pure fury. "And finally," Elena said, pulling the last blood-stained voucher from her shirt, This is Prescott's signature, paying for the rifles and the gunpowder, the same gunpowder that Red Jack's men used." She turned, her eyes boring into the sheriff. "Is it not? Sheriff Mace, does that signature match the one in your new ledger?" Every eye in the square, every farmer, every miner, every mother, turned to Mace. He was the center. He was the law. He looked at the ledger. He looked at Prescott, the man who owned him. He looked at Elena, Koyani, and Nate. Three people standing alone in the mud, holding the shattered pieces of the truth. Red Jack knew the moment had turned. He was not a man for words. He was a man of brute action. He did not aim at Mace. He did not aim at Koyani. He lifted his rifle and aimed it straight at Elena's heart. The world seemed to stop. Koyani moved. He was not a man. He was a force. Wounded, exhausted. He threw himself sideways, his one good shoulder hitting Elena in the ribs. He drove her off her feet, his body covering hers as they fell. The rifle cracked. The sound was deafening. The bullet that would have hit Elena shattered the glass of the bank window behind her, spraying the platform with glittering shards. Elena hit the mud. The air knocked from her lungs. Koyani's weight a heavy, protective shield. Red Jack was already working the lever of his rifle, trying to chamber another round, his face twisted in a snarl. A second shot boomed across the square, a heavier sound, a .45. Red Jack screamed, a high, thin sound, and his rifle clattered to the ground. He grabbed his right leg. Collapsing, a dark, flowering stain was spreading rapidly across his canvas trousers. Sheriff Mace stood in the middle of the street, his arm outstretched, his peacemaker smoking in his hand. He had made his choice. The crowd screamed and broke, scattering in every direction, trying to get away from the gunfire. "You are under arrest." "Jack!" Mace yelled, his voice shaking but loud. He walked forward, not lowering his gun. He did not stop at Red Jack. He kept walking, past him, toward the platform. He pointed the revolver at the banker. "And you, Prescott, You are under arrest for murder, for conspiracy." Prescott stared at the barrel of the gun. His face was not afraid. It was filled with a terrible, cold rage. He was not a man who could be arrested.
You absolute fool,
Prescott hissed, while Mace and the rest of the square were focused on Red Jack bleeding in the mud. Prescott took 2 quick steps backward. He pulled a long sulfur match from his vest pocket, struck it on the sole of his boot, and dropped it. He dropped it onto a thin, dark line of black powder that led from the platform to the open door of the assay office. The office Maria had warned her about. A few people saw it. A few people screamed. Elena, pushing herself up, saw the spark. She saw the fuse. "Get back!" she screamed. The world turned white and silent. The explosion was not a gunshot. It was a physical blow. The entire assay office building seemed to lift off the ground and then disintegrate. A wave of pure heat and force rolled across the square, throwing men and women like dolls. The windows of every building on the street shattered. The fire was immediate. The dry pine storefronts, the canvas market stalls, the hay bales. They ignited in a single, terrifying whoosh. The square was a vision of hell. Smoke, screams, running figures. And, in the chaos, Prescott was gone. He had not run from the explosion. He had used it. He vanished into the thick, black smoke he had created. The fire was spreading, fast, licking at the walls of the general store. Elena's first thought was a spike of pure ice. Ma. Her mother had come to the market, desperate to find Nate. Elena had seen her by the feed store. She saw her now. Martha Hart was on the ground, stunned by the blast. A heavy burning canvas awning from the store, its wooden supports snapped, was toppling directly toward her. "Ma!" Elena screamed, lurching to her feet, running. She was not fast enough. But Koyani was... He was a blur, sprinting across the burning, debris-strewn ground. He did not hesitate. He did not slow. He reached Martha a second before the blazing mass fell. He did not try to lift her. He threw himself over her, catching the full, crushing, fiery weight of the beam and the canvas on his own back, on his wounded shoulder. He roared. It was not a human sound. It was a sound of pure, animal agony, torn from his throat. But he did not collapse. His legs shook, his muscles strained, but he held the burning weight, creating a small pocket of survival. Elena and Nate got there, grabbing their mother, dragging her by the arms, pulling her clear. "Koyani!" Elena screamed, grabbing his arm. He let the burning mass fall, collapsing forward, rolling into the mud, his back and shirt smoldering. Nate ran back for him, dragging him away from the flames just as the rest of the wall fell in. The square was chaos, but Elena was not. She knew this enemy. She knew fire. She ran to Koyani, ripping a horse blanket from a nearby wagon, throwing it over his back to smother the flames. "Buckets!" she yelled, her voice a raw command that cut through the panic. "The trough! Form a line! Now!" The dazed, terrified townsfolk looked at her. They saw her, covered in mud, her face streaked with soot. They saw the Apache, the man who had just saved Martha Hart, kneeling in the mud, panting through a mask of terrible pain. And they obeyed. Sheriff Mace, his face cut and bleeding, was already on his feet. He grabbed a bucket. Nate was beside him. Men and women, their rivalries and fears burned away, formed a chain from the horse trough. They began to fight the fire, a desperate, practical army against the inferno Prescott had unleashed. They saved the street, but the assay office was gone. The general store was a smoking skeleton. The fire had been stopped, but the cost was devastating. Mace, his duty returned to him with a terrible clarity, was cuffing a whimpering, bleeding Red Jack. His deputies, their faces grim, rounded up the other members of the gang, who had been too stunned by the blast to escape. Elena was kneeling in front of Koyani by the water trough. His back was a ruin of new burns on top of the old wound. She bathed it gently with a clean rag. He did not flinch. He just breathed, his head bowed, his body trembling with shock. Martha Hart stood a few feet away, her arm cradled against her chest. She was watching Koyani. Her face was a ruin of its own. The hatred that had lived there for 2 years washed away by fire and a debt that could never be repaid. Mace walked over, his boots heavy in the ashen mud. He looked at the smoking buildings. He looked at Prescott's bank, its windows shattered but its structure solid, a monument to the man who had escaped. "He's gone," Mace said, his voice flat, "had a horse waiting in the east alley." Elena did not look up. "We know." Mace stood there for a long moment. He looked at the townsfolk, who were watching him, waiting. He walked to the notice board, which was still standing, miraculously untouched. He tore the wanted poster for Koyani, the one for $500, from the wood. He ripped it in half, then in half again. He dropped the pieces into a muddy puddle. "I am issuing a writ of temporary exoneration for Koyani of the Chiricahua people," Mace announced, his voice carrying over the square. "He is not a wanted man in this county. He is a free man. He is under my protection." He looked at Koyani, then at Elena. "I am going after Prescott. I will need a tracker." Koyani slowly, painfully, lifted his head. His face was slick with sweat and soot, but his eyes were clear. "He will not run for the border," Koyani said, his voice a rasp. "He will run to his partner. He will run to Captain Graham." The market square was a ruin of smoking timber and wet ash. Elena worked quickly, her hands sure, applying a thick, greasy salve to Koyani's back. The burns were shallow, but they were spread wide, and the old wound beneath them was weeping. He did not make a sound, but his body was rigid, a single, coiled muscle of endurance. Martha Hart stood watching, her good arm holding her injured one. She looked at the man who had shielded her, this Apache, and the hatred in her face, the grief that had defined her for 2 years, finally broke. It left her looking old and empty and terribly sad. She turned to her daughter. "Go, Elena! Finish this! Bring your brother home!" Sheriff Mace, his face streaked with blood and soot, repeated his words. "I need a tracker. Koyani." Koyani stood, his movement stiff. He nodded once. "He will go to Graham." Nate was already checking his rifle, his face grim. He was no longer a boy. He was a survivor. Mace looked at the townsfolk, his gaze landing on 2 men, Harlan and Elias. They were both deputies, both good men, and both had lost their businesses in the fire Prescott had set. They had nothing left to lose. "Get your horses," Mace ordered. "We ride in 5 minutes." The posse was 6, Mace and his 2 deputies, Harlan and Elias Koyani, his back a map of raw pain, Elena, her medical bag restocked and her peacemaker loaded, and Nate, his new knife at his belt, his eyes hard. They rode out of the ruined town, not speaking, the smell of smoke clinging to their clothes. Prescott had a 2-hour start. Koyani picked up his trail easily, the tracks of a single, hard-ridden horse, moving east. Prescott was not just running. He was running toward the Llano Estacado, the staked plains. "He is running to the flatlands," Koyani said, his voice a low rasp. "It is a test, an ocean of dry grass. He thinks we are town men. He thinks we will die of thirst before we catch him." Mace looked at his canteen. "We only have enough water for 2 days. Maybe." "We will find water," Koyani said, "or we will not, but we go." The desert was an anvil. The sun was a hammer. For 2 days, they rode into a flat, featureless world of baked earth and yellow grass. There was no shade, there was no landmark. There was only the heat and the wind and the endless aching blue of the sky. The horses suffered, their heads low. Nate, in his quiet anger, was pushing his mare too hard. Koyani reined in beside him. "Stop!" Nate looked at him, confused. "We will lose him." "You ride a straight line. You kill your horse. Watch me." Koyani took the lead, and the straight line of their pursuit changed. He began to lead them in a long, shallow, zigzagging pattern. It seemed slower. Elena rode up beside him.
Why?
A horse breathes with its steps, Koyani said, not looking at her. A straight line is a hard rhythm. It fights the horse. A curve lets the animal find its own breath. It saves strength. We will get there slower, but we will get there. The tension in the group grew with the heat. Harlan and Elias were good men, but they were men of streets and buildings. This emptiness was a new kind of enemy. Mace rode in silence, his guilt a palpable thing. He was a man chasing his own ghost. Elena, riding near him at dusk, heard him muttering to himself, his voice thick with self-recrimination. I should have stopped him. I should have seen the accounts. I let him do it. On the afternoon of the second day, the last canteen ran dry. They tipped it up, and only a few drops of lukewarm water moistened their cracked lips.
Elias, his voice hoarse, cursed. We are done. Mace, we have to turn back. We will die out here.
Koyani slid from his horse. His movements were slow, pained. He walked 20 yards to a wide, flat sheet of cracked rock. He knelt, wincing as his knees touched the hot stone. He placed his good hand flat on the rock. Then he lowered his head, pressing his ear to the stone. Elena dismounted and walked to him.
What are you doing?
Listening, he whispered. She knelt beside him. She heard nothing, only the thin, high wail of the wind. He stood, slowly. He walked 50 paces south to a shallow depression filled with dry sand and scrubby, dead-looking bushes. He pointed. Dig here. Harlan spat. It is just dust. Apache. Mace unslung his rifle. Dig. Nate and Harlan dug, their hands already raw. They clawed at the dry, packed earth. 2 feet down, the dirt was dark. 3 feet down, it was thick, cool mud. A moment later, a small, dark puddle of water seeped into the bottom of the hole. They stared at it. It was a miracle. It took an hour, letting it refill, carefully scooping the cloudy, metallic-tasting water into their canteens. But it was water. Elias looked at Koyani, his skepticism replaced by a raw, stunned respect. Koyani merely mounted his horse and stared east. Prescott had not stopped. On the third morning, they found the new tracks. 5 horses, shot by a military farrier. They had been waiting. Koyani nodded. Graham. They followed the combined trail into a region of broken rock, a sudden wound in the flat plains. They dismounted, leaving the horses with Harlan, and climbed a low ridge. Below them, in a rocky draw, was a camp. Prescott was there. His fine suit was torn and filthy. He was yelling, his voice thin and high, at a man in a blue, unbuttoned army tunic. Mace raised his spyglass. He cursed, long and low. That is him, Captain Graham. They watched, hidden by the rocks. You are a fool. Prescott, Graham shouted, his voice carrying on the clear air. The plan was to use the raiders, Red Jack, to break the treaty, to start a war, not to burn down the entire town. You brought the law down on us. Prescott laughed, a high, panicked sound. You think this is the law? The law is a piece of paper in my bank. The plan was to get the land. Your plan. The plan was to pin the murder of that bleeding heart officer on the Scout. Koyani's body went rigid. His breath stopped. He was hearing his own accusation, his own betrayal, spoken aloud by the men who had designed it. It was all a setup. The officer who had argued for peace had been murdered by Graham, and Koyani had been the perfect scapegoat. Until you got greedy, Graham snarled. The gold was never part of it. I am the bank, Prescott shrieked. Everything is part of it. Mace lowered the spyglass. His face was cold iron. He looked at Koyani, a look of profound, silent apology. We have them, he said, both of them. Mace laid out the plan. Harlan and Elias would circle wide, get up on the canyon rim. High ground. Elena and Nate, you stay here. Covering fire only. Koyani and I will go in low, from the mouth of the draw. We take them alive. The plan lasted 10 seconds. Nate, his blood hot, his anger at hearing the betrayal boiling over, moved too fast. A small rock skittered under his boot, rattling down the slope. Graham's head snapped up. His hand went to his pistol. Ambush. The draw exploded in gunfire. Bullets ricocheted, screaming off the rock walls. Mace roared. "Harlan, Elias, now!" From the ridge, the deputies opened fire, their rifle shots cracking down into the camp. Koyani grabbed Mace, pulling him behind a thick boulder as a spray of bullets chewed the rock where they had been. He raised his own rifle, his burned back screaming in protest. He fired, not at Graham, but at the rock face above him. The bullet whined off the stone, showering Graham with stinging rock chips, forcing him to duck. Mace saw the tactic and did the same, using the ricochets to keep their heads down. Elena was firing, her rifle pressed tight to her shoulder. She was not aiming at the men. She was aiming at their cover, pinning them. Prescott was not a fighter. He was a banker. He was running. He scrambled toward the back of the draw, where a heavy supply wagon was hidden, its horses already hitched. Elena saw him, the powder wagon, Maria's warning. It was his escape. Nate saw him too. He stood up, trying to get a clear shot at the man who had destroyed their lives.
"Nate!" Elena screamed. "Get down!"
A soldier, one of Graham's 3 men, saw Nate. He dropped to one knee, taking careful aim at the boy. Elias, on the ridge, saw the soldier. He saw the boy. He stood, exposing himself to get a clear line of fire. Elias fired, his bullet hitting the soldier in the chest. But Graham, a crack shot, spun at the movement and fired at the ridge. Elias grunted, a single, sharp sound of surprise. He clutched his chest. He stood for one long second, outlined against the blue sky, and then toppled forward, rolling silently down the rocky slope. Harlan screamed his name, Elias. Mace saw his friend fall. He saw him lie still. The face of the man who had been riddled with guilt disappeared, replaced by the mask of the executioner. All his debts were paid. "Close the book!" Mace roared, and he stood, walking out from behind the boulder, firing his revolver. Prescott had reached the wagon. He was on the seat, grabbing the reins. Elena raised her rifle. Her hands were not shaking. She was cold. She saw the wagon. She saw Prescott. She saw the body of Elias. She breathed out, a long, slow breath. She squeezed the trigger. The shot was long, over 100 yards. It was perfect. The heavy slug smashed into the rear wooden wheel of the wagon. The axle spokes shattered, splintering. The wheel collapsed, and the heavy wagon lurched, its axle digging deep into the hard-packed earth. It was not going anywhere. Prescott was trapped. Graham saw his escape route broken. He saw Harlan pinning down his last man. He saw Mace advancing, his face a mask of terrible judgment. He threw his gun down. "I surrender. I am a United States Army officer." Mace walked straight up to him, his revolver steady, and smashed the barrel of it across Graham's jaw, sending him sprawling into the dust. Elena and Nate ran to Elias. Elena knelt, her hands already moving to open his shirt, but she knew. She saw his open, staring eyes. The shot was through the heart. Harlan scrambled down the slope, his face a mess of tears and dust. He just knelt, touching his friend's shoulder, shaking his head. Elena stood up. She looked at her rifle. She looked at the body of the deputy. She looked at the broken wagon. Her hands began to shake. It started in her fingers, then her wrists, then her arms, a violent, uncontrollable tremor. She dropped the rifle, the metal clattering on the stones. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to make it stop, but she could not. It was the cost, the adrenaline, the life taken. Koyani walked over to her. His back was bleeding freely, his face pale with his own agony, but his feet were steady. He placed his good hand on her shoulder. He did not pull her close. He just held her, a solid, warm anchor in the shaking storm.
"Fear does not make you weak."
"Elena," he said, his voice low and rough. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, tears blurring the image of his face. "To be afraid and to still move," he said, "that is strength." She leaned into his hand. Just for a second, she took a deep, shuddering breath. The shaking did not stop, but it eased. Mace and Harlan were tying Graham and Prescott, their movements rough and efficient. They buried Elias under a cairn of stones. A silent, grim ceremony. Koyani was scouting the ground near where Graham's men had been. He found it, a new blood trail. This one, not from Elias. One of Graham's men, wounded, had slipped away during the fight. Koyani pointed north, his arm steady. "He is not running. He is heading for their final camp." The trail led north, toward the great white alkali plain, toward the salt flats. They moved north, a grim, exhausted procession. Mace and Harlan, their faces like carved stone, led the prisoners. Graham, his jaw swollen and dark, walked with a bitter, arrogant pride. Prescott, his fine suit in tatters, stumbled, whimpering, his hands bound so tightly his fingers were blue. Koyani, Elena, and Nate brought up the rear, their eyes on the horizon, following the faint, bloody trail. The trail led them to the edge of the world. The Llano Estacado gave way to the Alkali Flats, a vast, white scar under the sun. It was a place of illusions, a dried-up ocean of salt that stretched for miles, glaring with a white light so bright it was a physical pain. The air was dead, and the heat shimmered, making the horizon dance. There was no cover, no trees, no rocks, no gullies, just a flat, white emptiness. The blood trail, dark spatters against the white crust, was hideously clear. "He is wounded," Harlan said, his voice a dry croak. "He cannot have gone far." "He is leading us," Koyani said, his voice low. He stopped, his gaze sweeping the white expanse. "This is a trap." Mace looked at the endless, open ground. "A trap. Here, there is nowhere to hide." "That is the trap," Koyani said. He pointed. "The heat, the light. We are blind. He is not." Mace squinted, his hand shielding his eyes. He saw nothing, just white. He shook his head, his grief for Elias hardening into a stubborn line. "We finished this. We are not turning back." They stepped onto the salt. The crust crunched under their boots like frozen snow. The heat reflected from below, burning their faces, cooking them from both sides. Every step was an effort. They were a quarter mile in, a small, dark cluster of figures in a sea of blinding light, when the shot came. It was not aimed at them. It was aimed at the prisoners. The bullet, fired from an impossible distance, did not hit a man. It hit the rope that bound Graham's hands. The shot came from a shimmer, a ripple in the heat 1,000 yards away. The wounded soldier, he had been waiting. Graham did not hesitate. The rope fell away. In one fluid motion, he drove his elbow back into Harlan's stomach, dropping him. He grabbed Harlan's rifle, spun, and fired at Mace, all before Prescott had even realized he was free. The bullet struck the badge on Mace's chest. The impact was so powerful it threw the sheriff backward, knocking him breathless to the ground, the star-shaped piece of metal saving his life. Nate and Elena dove for the ground, but there was no cover. They were exposed. Graham fired again, at Koyani. Koyani twisted, the bullet searing the air where he had been. Prescott, screaming, fumbled with his own ropes. The first shot having frayed them, he got his hands free. They had 2 free men, one of them a trained army captain, and they were in the middle of a killing floor. Koyani grabbed Elena, pulling her down flat. "Stay down. Do not move." "We need a diversion," Mace gasped, clutching his bruised chest. "Harlan, pin them!" Harlan, his rifle gone, was unarmed. He and Mace had only their revolvers. Useless at this range. The wounded soldier was firing steadily, his bullets kicking up puffs of salt, forcing them to stay flat. Koyani knew this landscape. He knew its weapons. He crawled towards Nate. "The rope," he hissed, "and your dark blanket." Nate, his face white but his hands steady, unslung his bedroll. Koyani pointed to a low patch of dead, salty brush, the only vegetation for a mile. "Burn that." "How?" Koyani pulled a small lens, a fire starter, from his pouch. "Use the sun." While Nate focused the tiny point of light on the tinder-dry leaves, Koyani crawled back to Elena. "Graham is smart," he whispered, his breath hot. "Prescott is a coward. We must split them." "How?" "I will make a shadow. You will make him chase it." Nate got the leaves to smolder. The brush was thick with salt, and as it caught, it did not burn with a clean smoke. It billowed a thick, acrid, oily black cloud, a dark stain in the white world. Graham and the soldier, their vision obscured, stopped firing. "Now," Koyani said. He took the dark blanket from Nate. He wrapped it around himself. He stood up in the smoke, a large, dark, moving target. He ran, low and fast, to the left. Graham saw the movement. He saw the man running. "There he is!" he yelled. "He is flanking us!" Graham and the soldier opened fire on the running shadow, their bullets churning the salt. "Koyani!" Elena screamed, thinking he was sacrificing himself. But as the smoke thinned, she saw Koyani was not there. He had used the blanket as a decoy, throwing it, and was now crawling rapidly to the right, a phantom against the white, unseen. Graham, realizing he had been tricked, snarled in frustration. Prescott, meanwhile, was not running toward Graham. He was running back toward the wagon they had left at the edge of the flats, the wagon that still held a small keg of black powder. Nate saw him. "I see Prescott. He is going for the wagon." "Go," Elena said. "Get him! Nate! Be the shadow!" Nate nodded, and gripping the rope from his saddle, he disappeared, running low, circling wide to cut Prescott off. The battlefield was now split. Nate was after Prescott. Mace and Harlan were pinned by the soldier, and Koyani and Graham were stalking each other in the white glare. Elena was alone in the center. She saw movement to her right. Koyani. He had circled. He was coming up behind Graham. But Graham was a veteran. He sensed it. He spun, not with his rifle, but with a knife. Koyani, his own knife in his good hand, met him. It was not a long, elegant fight. It was brutal, close, and desperate. Graham was a trained soldier, strong and fast. Koyani was wounded, his back and shoulder a ruin of pain. Graham parried Koyani's lunge, the steel ringing. He drove a boot into Koyani's wounded shoulder. Koyani cried out, falling to one knee. Graham laughed, kicking the knife from Koyani's hand. He placed his boot on Koyani's chest, pinning him to the salt. "You," he spat, his face a mask of contempt. "You are a good tool, a perfect savage to blame. You think these people, this town, this tin-star sheriff, gives a damn about you. Justice." Graham laughed, a harsh, dry sound. "Justice is just a stamp. Scout. It is the stamp the man with the most money puts on his own greed. And Prescott, he had the money. I just had the army." He raised his own knife, its point aimed at Koyani's throat. From across the flat, Mace saw it. Harlan had finally gotten a bead on the distant soldier, and their shots were exchanging. A deadly, long-range duel. But Mace saw Koyani go down. Mace, his chest a single, massive bruise, rose to one knee. He looked at Graham, the man who had ordered the murder that started all this, the man who had caused Elias's death. He raised his revolver. It was too far. A pistol shot at this range was impossible. Elena saw it too. She saw Koyani, pinned. She saw Graham's knife. She stood up, raising her own rifle. Graham, seeing her, changed his target. The greater threat, the woman who had cost him his wagon. He smiled, pulling his pistol from his belt, letting Koyani live for one more second. He would kill her first. He leveled his pistol at Elena. Mace, Harlan, Koyani, Elena, they were all in a frozen, terrible tableau. A single rifle shot cracked across the white plain. It was not from Harlan. It was not from Elena. Captain Graham's head snapped back. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of his blue tunic. He stood for a second, his expression one of pure, blank surprise. Then he collapsed, falling sideways off Koyani, his body limp. Mace stood tall, his smoking rifle in his hand. He had not used the pistol. He had crawled to Harlan's dropped rifle. The one shot he had, he made. The sound of the shot echoed, once, and then died, leaving a profound, ringing silence. The justice of Elias was complete. Mace lowered the rifle. He looked at Graham's body. He did not say a word. He just read the arrest warrant, his voice a low monotone. To the dead man. The book was closed. Across the flat, Prescott heard the shot. He saw Graham fall. He had reached the wagon. He was desperate, a cornered rat. He scrambled into the back, grabbing the small keg of black powder. He was not trying to escape. He was trying to take them with him. Koyani, pushing himself to his feet, saw him. He saw the short fuse. He saw Prescott strike a match. Elena was running toward Koyani. Koyani saw her. He saw the wagon. He ran, not away, but at her. He tackled her, driving her flat against the salt crust, his body shielding hers, just as Prescott lit the fuse. "Run, you fools!" Prescott shrieked. The wagon disappeared in a cloud of yellow flame and black smoke. The sound was a flat, deafening whump that shuddered the ground. Shrapnel, pieces of burning wood and metal, screamed through the air. Koyani cried out as a long, sharp splinter of wood from the wagon wheel, the one Elena had shot, tore a bloody groove along his forearm. The smoke cleared. Prescott was gone. Mace and Harlan ran forward, their guns out. "Wait," Elena said, grabbing Koyani's bleeding arm. A figure emerged from the smoke, coughing, his clothes torn. It was Nate. He was not alone. He was dragging Prescott, who was kicking and screaming. The banker was tied, his hands bound tightly behind him, his ankles hobbled. Nate had done it. He had circled. He had used the smoke from the explosion as his cover. And when Prescott had been thrown clear, Nate had been on him before he could stand. The rope was tied in a complex, non-slip loop, the survival knot, the one Koyani had taught him all those days ago in the ranch yard. Nate looked at Koyani, then at Mace. He just nodded, his face streaked with soot and salt, his knuckles bloody. The last of Graham's men, seeing his captain dead and his escape gone, had surrendered to Harlan. It was over. The small, greasy fire from the exploded wagon sputtered on the white salt. It tried to catch, to spread, but there was nothing to burn. The salt crust was sterile. There was no grass. There was no wood. In seconds, the fire was nothing but a black, smoking patch. The hatred had run out of fuel. The wind, the only thing that lived in this place, blew across the flats, carrying the acrid smell of powder away. It left only the silence, the white, and the exhaustion. Mace, Harlan, and Nate lifted Prescott, now a sobbing, broken man, and tied him to a horse. Koyani, his arm bound by Elena, leaned against her, his strength finally gone. They gathered their wounded. They retrieved the body of Elias. Wordlessly. The small, tired group turned west. They led their prisoners away from the White Plains, leaving the dead to the silence. and began the long, slow walk home. The journey back was a silent procession of the living and the dead. They carried the body of Elias wrapped in a blanket, his presence a heavy, constant reminder of the cost. Prescott, tied to his horse, had descended into a whimpering, broken wreck, his threats replaced by pleas for water. Captain Graham was silent, his arrogance replaced by a cold, hard appraisal of his future. He was a soldier. He knew what awaited him at a court-martial. When they rode into the single dusty street of the town, the people came out of their houses and the saloon. They did not cheer. They did not shout. They watched, their faces grim. As Sheriff Mason Harlan, their faces black with soot and grief, led the prisoners to the jail, they saw the banker, the man who had owned them, now a filthy, bound captive. They saw the body of Elias, and they saw Koyani, his back a map of fire and blood, riding stirrup to stirrup with Elena Hart. Mace did not make a speech. He locked his prisoners in the cells. Then he walked to his office, Harlan at his side, and began to write. He wrote for 2 hours. He wrote the official report, detailing the confession of Captain Graham, the evidence from Prescott's ledger, the testimony of Red Jack's captured men. He wrote about the murder of the army officer, the framing of Koyani, the ambush at Cottonwood Creek, and the explosion that had shattered their town. He wrote about the death of Elias. He signed it. Harlan signed it, and then he asked Elena and Nate to sign it as witnesses. He sent the telegraph. Within 2 days, 4 federal marshals rode in from Santa Fe. They read Mace's report, looked at the prisoners, and at the burned-out square. They loaded Prescott, Graham, and the remnants of Red Jack's gang into a heavy prison wagon. The entire town watched as the wagon rolled out. Heading east, it was the end of an era. The false bottom of their prosperity had been ripped out, and the truth, ugly and violent, had been exposed. In the silence that followed, the town began to change. The first change was Maria Valdez. She stepped out of the dusty lily, not with a ledger, but with a hammer. She had bought the burned-out lot where the assay office and general store had stood. She did not rebuild the bank. She rebuilt the market. She hired men, paying them fair wages, to build new stalls, a new feed store, and in the center, where Prescott's platform had stood, she built a small, brightly painted wooden stage. A week later, on a Saturday night, music played in the square for the first time. It was not a tinny piano. It was a guitar and a violin playing the fast, sad, beautiful songs of Mexico. The week after, an old Apache man came from the reservation. He sat on the stage and played a wooden flute. The sound was like the wind on the high mesas. People gathered. They listened. They began to trade, not with the bank's scrip, but with corn, with blankets, with silver, and with their word. The second change happened at the Hart Ranch. They were rebuilding the barn. All of them. Elena, Nate, and Koyani worked from sunup to sundown. The new pine smelled clean, a sharp contrast to the lingering scent of ash. Koyani, his back and arm wrapped in clean bandages, could not lift heavy beams, but he was a master of detail. He showed Nate how to set the trusses, how to notch the wood so it would hold against the wind. He was patient, his voice quiet, and Nate, who had left a boy, was now a man, listening and learning. Martha Hart watched them from the porch. She had not spoken to Koyani directly. She had only nodded, her face pale, when he had been brought, half-conscious, back to the ranch. She had brought him broth. She had brought him salves, but she had not spoken. On the 3rd day of the rebuilding, she came out into the yard. She was holding something in her hands. It was a long, beautiful piece of wool, woven in a pattern of blue and white, and fringed with silk. It was old, and very fine. She walked directly to Koyani, who stopped his work, his hands full of rope. He looked at her, his dark eyes wary, but not unkind. Martha stopped in front of him. She unfolded the shawl. "This," she said, her voice shaking, but clear, "this was my grandmother's. She was married in it. I was married in it. She held it out to him. Her hands were trembling. She looked at his burned back, at the wounds he had taken to save her. You saved me from the fire. I know, Koyani said, his voice gentle. No, Martha said, her eyes filling with tears. The first Elena had seen in 2 years. You saved me. Before that, you, an Apache, saved me from the fire that has been burning in my heart, the fire I used to hate. She looked at the ashes of the old stable. It was not you. It was not your people. It was just greed. It was just a man. I have been hating a shadow. She pushed the shawl into his hands. It is a poor trade, for a life, but it is all I have. It is for your wedding, with her. She pointed at Elena. Koyani looked at the shawl. He understood the weight of the gift. He did not refuse it. He took it, the fine wool soft in his calloused, scarred hands. He bowed his head. Thank you, he said. Martha Hart nodded. A single, sharp movement of release. She turned, and for the first time, she did not look like a ghost. She looked like a woman who had just set down a terrible burden. She walked back into the house, leaving the bright, clean future in the yard, in the sun. A week later, the barn was finished. The air was cool. The promise of a good winter in the wind. Elena found herself at Cottonwood Creek. She was just riding, letting the mare walk, and her path had led her here. The grove was no longer a place of ambush. The trees were turning yellow, their leaves bright against the blue sky. The water in the creek was high and clear from the rain. He was already there. Koyani was standing by the water, skipping flat stones. He moved with a new ease. His wounds were healing. The deep lines of pain around his eyes were gone. He heard her, but did not turn. Your horse walks loud, he said, a smile in his voice. You are thinking too hard. Elena dismounted. She stood beside him. I was just thinking. This place, it is where I found you. He nodded, finding another stone. It is a good place. The water is clean. They stood in a comfortable, quiet companionship. The memory of the blood on the rocks was still there, but it was overlaid with this new peace. The peace they had earned. If I make coffee tomorrow, Elena said, trying to keep her voice light, and if, by some miracle, I make it so it is not so bitter, would you be disappointed? Koyani turned to look at her. His smile was slow and warm. He touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. No, he said, I would just add salt to make it taste right. She laughed, a real, easy laugh. He did not laugh. His expression grew serious. He reached into his pocket. He did not pull out a ring. He pulled out a simple leather thong. Strung on it were 10 beads of dried, blue corn, the color of peace, the food of his people. And between them was a single, thin piece of silver, worn smooth with time, with a small hole drilled through it. It is not much, he said. The corn is for the new life, the new food, the silver. It was my mother's. It is for the long road. He had heard her story. He knew her history. He knew her language. He held it out to her. It is not a promise to forget, Elena. It is a promise to remember, together. Elena looked at the simple, powerful offering. It was more real than any diamond. She did not cry. She just nodded, her throat tight. She turned, and he put the necklace around her neck. The leather was warm against her skin. They were married 2 weeks later. It was not in a church. It was not in the town. It was on the ranch, under the wide, open sky. Maria Valdez came, and Harlan. Martha stood beside Elena, wearing a new blue dress. Nate stood beside Koyani, wearing the knife he had been given. The old Apache flute player came. He played a song that sounded like the wind, and Mace read a few words from a book. It was simple. It was real. Their first act as a married couple was not a party. It was work. The old well pump, the one Koyani had fixed, was not enough. The fire had shown them how vulnerable they were. The whole valley was vulnerable. Koyani had a plan. They sold 2 of Elena's horses. They used the money, and some from Maria, to buy the parts for a new, tall windmill. They built it together, Koyani, Elena, and Nate. They set the tower, anchored it in stone. They built a new, long water trough, made of stone and cedar. When it was done, the great fan turned in the wind, a steady, creaking promise. It did not just fill their trough, it filled a second one they had built on the other side of their fence, near the road. It was for their neighbors, for the families, miners, and travelers who had nothing. The water was free. The water was for everyone. The fire had been Prescott's private, hoarding greed. The water was their shared, public future. One evening, Elena stood on the porch, watching the new windmill spin against the red sunset. The sound of the flute carried on the wind from the reservation. Inside the house, she could hear her mother and Nate arguing, with warmth, about dinner. Koyani came and stood beside her. He did not speak, just wrapped his arm around her. She leaned into his side, his good side, and looked out at the land. The mesas were still red. The wind was still a thief. The land was still hard. It was not a paradise. It would never be easy. She looked at the new silver fan of the windmill, pulling life from the deep earth. She looked at the water, shining in the trough, a beacon for travelers. She finally understood. Freedom was not a thing that fell from the sky. It was not a gift from a banker or a sheriff. It was a thing you built, a thing you earned, every single day, with practical, kind, and difficult choices. It was a thing you built together. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love to connect with all of you, so please comment below with where you are listening from. Share your thoughts, and be sure to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.